Well, hello there folks, this is Peter Skova at Music is a Journey. Today's video topic is bands that I got into. Classic bands that I got into just around the time of a new release after a bit of a release gap. That's actually going to make a very long video title. I'm going to have to think how to shorten that one. But hey, let's get on with it. So there are 5 bands I'm going to talk about in this video, bands that I really got into and whose discographies I pretty much have just about everything as far as studio albums is concerned. Studio albums are concerned. And we'll get on with it right away with the first one on the list, and this is probably the one that best suits the criteria. So around, I'm going to say it was around 1984, because I certainly remember I was still in 7th grade. Beginning of 1984, I was still in 7th grade, and I was, of course, already a big fan of heavy metal, and I had started looking back into earlier heavy music, and one of the bands, of course, that I got into was Deep Purple. Now, Deep Purple's catalog at that time, there was not a lot available on cassette. Of course, there was Machine Head and In Rock, and after that, it was 24 Karat Purple, the very best of Deep Purple, and When We Rock, and When We Roll, We Roll. And that was pretty much it. However, around that time, the first 3 albums were re-released on cassette. Unfortunately, the recordings were just taken directly from vinyl, so you could hear the pops and scratches from a vinyl record on the cassette. In fact, when I listened to River Deep, Mountain High, I can still hear the parts at the beginning where there would be some pops and scratches. Around that time, because I was so much interested in Deep Purple, I got a hold of this book here, the illustrated biography by Chris Charlesworth. Pictures on the back of the different marks, Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 4. And as far as this book told, there were some attempts, or at least ideas, to get the band back together in one form or another, but nothing had ever materialized. And, you know, the history of Deep Purple was written and done as far as the book was concerned. However, of course, 1984, shortly after that, came the big announcement the Mark II lineup had regrouped and were going to put out another album. So there in October of 1984, when I started 8th grade, well obviously in September, came out Deep Purple's Perfect Strangers. And personally, I think this is one of the best comeback albums ever. Side 1 is mostly perfect all the way through. I mean, Knocking at Your Back Door, Under the Gun, Nobody's Home. Those 3 songs there I think are all terrific. Main Streak is not bad, not bad. And then we start with Perfect Strangers on Part 2, which is one of my favorite Deep Purple songs. Gypsy's Kiss is also pretty cool. Hungry Days is one of them. And this one also includes the track Not Responsible, which was on the cassette, but apparently not available on the LP at the time. So Deep Purple's Perfect Strangers, this came out, and one of the good things about this coming out and becoming popular was that Burn and Fireball both became released on cassette. Oh, of course, Deep Purple with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and Deep Purple Live in Japan, made in Japan, both of those were available on cassette at the time as well. But, you know, they were live albums. And I recall the Philharmonic Orchestra one, it was just the group and orchestral pieces only. I think the CD comes with some additional tracks, such as an early rendition of Child in Time, if I remember correctly. So anyway, Deep Purple's Perfect Strangers, and man, I was really into Deep Purple by this time. So chronologically, the next one was up to about 1986. I pretty much stuck with hard rock and heavy metal. I think the most lightweight thing I was into was probably Bon Jovi, and that wasn't exactly one of my favorites. Granted, of course, I also liked Journey and Boston, so I guess there was a slightly lighter side to it. But I think one of the first bands where I really stepped away from what was obviously hard rock or heavy metal was Pink Floyd. And so it was around 1986 or early 87 when I started taking up an interest in the band. First, I probably picked up The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon first. I remember hearing about Animals from somewhere, so I probably got that one, and Wish You Were Here. And I also jumped around a lot. I think actually one of the very first albums I got was A Saucer Full of Secrets. And unlike Deep Purple, pretty much everything Pink Floyd released was available on cassette. So it didn't take me long to have everything on cassette, right from Piper at the Gates of Dawn all the way up to the final cut. Now, of course, Pink Floyd met with a kind of, well, one of the most famous breakups in history there, mostly due to the tensions between Roger Waters and David Gilmour. Roger Waters seeing Pink Floyd more and more as the vehicle for his creative, his creative delivery, the band that would help him realize all his ideas, whereas David Gilmour had his own artistic vision and sometimes did not like the ideas that Roger Waters was coming up with. Particularly, there were a lot of the tracks that ended up on the final cut, which were talked about during The Wall, but Roger Waters had decided they weren't suitable for The Wall. And then just a couple of years later, he starts bringing them out for the next album, and David Gilmour was like, we're not going to do another War album. And, you know, you said these songs weren't good enough for the last album, now suddenly they're good enough for this one? I actually quite like the final cut and The Wall. Something about them I really like. So anyway, there it was, late 86, early 87, when I got interested in Pink Floyd, and then came the big news that in spite of the breakup, in spite of the fact that Roger Waters thought the band could never continue without him, they continued without him. So here we have a momentary lapse of reason. Again, this album was probably one of the first albums to really take a step aside from what I was listening to, other than perhaps the early Deep Purple albums. Of course, there was a lot of stuff that was not hard rock on those. But, you know, the opening track here, what is it called? Actually, I haven't listened to it for a long time. Signs of Life. I really loved that with the like radio type voices coming in as a signal, and these like burbling sounds, and the sounds of the boat on the river, and then just the different, I don't know, the whole music thing. It just made me feel like I was watching the introduction to a science documentary or something like that. Really cool. And then, of course, Learning to Fly, the single, and what a great song. I also really liked One Slip, which mentions the title of the album in it. And On the Turning Away, I think is an absolutely brilliant work. Side 2 continued, lots of cool instrumentals or songs with extended instrumental sections. I found I just really liked a lot of the sounds and a lot of the music on this. There's that one long instrumental, what is it called now? Terminal Frost. And there's that one part where it builds up and then the saxophone solo comes in. I mean, you just feel like you're flying over the mountaintops. Yeah, so I really liked this album. Now, I've heard a lot of criticism from people against it, but I like it, and I went to the concert, got the t-shirt, yeah, which I still have in a box in the other room. So Rush was a band that I knew about, well, since the beginning, really, because the very first cassette that I owned that I wanted was a compilation album that had Tom Sawyer on it. And the next album I got was Bob and Doug McKenzie's Great White North, which featured Geddy Lee on there as a guest for some of the dialogue, as well as singing the chorus of their song Take Off, Take Off to the Great White North. But what I heard from Rush coming out in the 1980s, after that, none of it was really to my taste. And I had written off Rush as a kind of, like new wave, jangly pop rock band. But I still always paid attention when I heard some of their songs in the 90s, like Roll the Bones. The rap part, I didn't really need that. But then finally, when Test for Echo came out, I heard one of the songs and I thought, that's my gateway points. Okay, so I bought Test for Echo. That was soon followed up with Moving Pictures and Signals, Permanent Waves, and then finally the Feedback EP. And that's where my interest in the band stopped for a while, until the fall of 2010. I was reading the Wikipedia article on the band, and I had no idea that they were so accomplished and held in such high regard. So I got 2112 and Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres, and after that I just worked my way through the catalog until within a couple of months I had everything. And honestly, I listened to Rush almost exclusively for 6 months. And then, of course, in 2011 came the announcement they were releasing a new album. 2 songs were released as singles, which I bought from iTunes. And then they announced there was a delay on the album and it wouldn't come out until 2012. So finally, I think it was June 12th, 2012, 6/12/12, they released Clockwork Angels. And I really like this album. I like the concept of it. I like a lot of the songs. Headlong Flight is one of my favorite Rush songs. A lot of the other ones in here were really good. It was, as I thought at the time, if this is their last album, that is going to be a great way to finish. Since then, I've heard some of the excitement of the reviews of this album have what, being tempered somewhat. In fact, some people actually admit they don't like it so much. Honestly, I don't like the way the drums are mixed on this album. But aside from that, I think it's really good. And again, a nice way to finish up their catalog. Unlike some bands, Black Sabbath, whose last album left some people wanting. So anyway, Rush, and this album, of course, came out 6 years after Snakes and Angels. So there was a gap there as well. Okay, so after my 6 months of Rush, I began reading about their influences, and I learned about Genesis and Yes were actually progressive rock bands from the 70s, and I didn't really know very much about that. So I thought, okay, well, let me start with Yes. And I had the Yes album on cassette way back when, liked a couple of songs, and got rid of it with all my cassettes. So I thought, okay, we're not going to get that one. Let's get Close to the Edge and Fragile. So I started with those two, and oh, what a great starting point that was. So very soon after that, I ended up getting all of the studio albums of Yes within about 3 months. And this we're talking about probably around May or June of 2011. So pretty soon it was announced, yes, we're coming out with a new album. Fly From Here, released, I think it was also in June 2011, so actually a year before the Rush album. Now this album is the only one with Benoit David on vocals, and it's taken a lot of flack. Some people don't like that the song, which was written by Jeff Downes and Trevor Horn way back in the late 70s even, and introduced to the band back in 79, 1980, and was then later on shelved, was revived and then turned into a side-long epic, which was then broken up into parts. Some people didn't like that, again, no John Anderson, and they had accepted Trevor Horn on drama, but they were certainly not going to accept Benoit David this time, I don't know, because I was just getting into the band and I was reading about their history and I knew what albums people liked and what albums people didn't like, which were the ones that, burned people's groins, whatever. I took it for what it was. I thought, yeah, there are some great songs on here, there's some really entertaining music, and I do like the sound of the album. Of course, this is not one I would put in my top 10 or might make the top 15. But yeah, there's still tracks on here that I like, and though I don't listen to it very much, every once in a while, like every, 7 years? I might pop it in and give it a listen. So anyway, Fly From Here, yes, coming out in 2011, some 10 years after the release of Magnification and after lots of changes in the band. So the final band to talk about, this one here is slightly different because the release after a long gap came a year or so before I got into the band. So Styx, I knew Mr. Roboto, and that was pretty much it. I'd probably heard other Styx songs, I just didn't know they were songs by Styx. And again, I had Styx pegged as, a techno-pop band because of Mr. Roboto, and I had no interest in them. But later on during the 2010s, as I was exploring progressive rock more, I noticed that Styx was showing up. And of course, same with Yes and Genesis, you had to go back and check out their 70s stuff to find out where the prog was. And everybody was talking about the Grand Illusion, so I got that. And yeah, it wasn't the same as Yes or Genesis, but it had some pretty cool music on it. And I thought, okay, that's all right, but, where do I go next? And so out of curiosity, I ended up just buying The Serpent is Rising, the third album, which is like one of the ones that, Dennis DeYoung hates it, and not really one of the fan favorites either. But again, I thought, okay, it has some decent songs. And I don't know, at some point, I just hit upon, I don't know what album it was, maybe it was Equinox, maybe it was Pieces of Eight, but just somewhere along the way, I just thought, you know what? I like this band. And once again, as with the other bands, I had to start gathering together the entire discography. And of course, then I had learned that after the 2003, their last release of original songs, Cyclorama, and then was 2005, they had that cover album, Big Bang Theory, which I have, which I listened to only once. There was this long gap until 2017 when they had released The Mission. And I heard this, and Lawrence Gowan is on here. Not that I'm a big fan or anything, but he's Canadian, so that always earns points. And I thought this was a great album. I thought they had really done something, waiting all those years And finally, putting everything together, it turned out to be a really cool thing. And then within a year or so after that, they released Crash of the Crown, which I also really enjoyed. So that is the last of the 5 there, Styx, after probably the longest gap out of all of them. So, do you have any bands like that? Any bands that had some long gap in their release, and then, like, we're talking about 4 years, 5 years or more, and then suddenly a new album came out just around the time that you started getting into them? If you know of any bands like that, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Otherwise, just leave me any comments you like. And thanks for watching. See you in another video next week. Bye, folks.